Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's AgileLIVE webinar, Measuring the Success of Your Agile Transformation, Part 1. I'm Aaron Smith, the Editorial Director for Projects at Work, and I'm excited to be moderating today's AgileLIVE webinar sponsored by Version 1. These thought leadership webinars are focused on helping organizations scale Agile faster, easier, and smarter. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few logistics. The presentation will last approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. For those of you who haven't used On24 before, I would like to point out a few areas on the audience console. All participants are muted throughout the presentation, so if you have any questions, please send them through the Q&A panel on your console. At the end of the presentation, we will answer as many questions as we have time for. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you after today's webinar. If you have any technical questions, please send a note through the Q&A panel, and an On24 representative will be happy to assist you. I would also like to encourage everyone to share your aha moments with others during the event using the Twitter panel. And finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending an email in a few days with a link to the recording. Now on to the presentation featuring Brad Swanson, Vice President and Senior Agile Coach at Agile 42. Brad started his software career at age 10 on the Apple IIe, and now he is a certified Scrum trainer and certified Scrum coach with 20 years of experience in project and program leadership, product management, and software development in both startups and large companies. Brad, I am looking forward to hearing your insights on defining success factors in Agile transformations, the application of leading and lagging indicators, and how to avoid bad metrics. I know you have some solid real-world examples that should resonate with our audience. Brad, the microphone is all yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Aaron. Thanks for the introduction, and welcome, everybody. Let's dive right in. We wanted to actually start off with a little bit of interactivity. So we have a poll to kick things off for the audience to participate in. So we've got the poll posted up now. We'll ask everybody to just take a few seconds and answer this question as you best can, and we'll see what the results turn out to be here in a moment. Give everybody a few more seconds. Looks like a few people still haven't answered the poll, but we'll look at the results here momentarily. All right, there may be a few more results still coming in, but we'll just take a look at how it's looking so far here. Ask this question just to kind of set the stage for thinking about what's important to measure in an Agile transformation. And while certainly we want to look at some aspects of process compliance or following good Agile practices, one mistake I've seen often is organizations that overemphasize that and underemphasize the business outcomes and some of the larger, broader things that we want to measure in terms of success. So set the stage with that. We'll move into the meat, if you will, of the presentation now. So thanks to everybody for chiming in on our poll here. Okay, so before we can have a meaningful conversation about measuring an Agile transformation, I think it's important to start with, at the highest level, a framework for how do you go about implementing an Agile transition or an Agile transformation. And at Agile 42, we have an empirical or evidence-based incremental framework for Agile transition. And our philosophy is that using the empirical approach and using an evolutionary incremental approach is very important, one that's based on real measurement along the way. It's a little bit beyond the scope of today's presentation to talk about every element here in our enterprise transition framework, but I just want to highlight the 4 major steps. That first one is the assessment, understanding where we're at a point in time. Next is the strategy. How are we going to make a change? Third is the pilot phase, or if you will, the experimental part of this. This is where we run experiments around changes in a safe-to-fail environment to prove and measure the results of those changes before deciding whether or not we want to roll out or institutionalize those changes in a broader way across the organization. So those are the 4 major steps. I've provided a link here if you're interested to read more about the enterprise transition framework. Today we'll be talking mostly about the strategy and the pilot phases here, which is where we define a strategy, define some metrics for different elements of that strategy, and then run those experiments to determine what's going to work within that strategy. The important point here is, again, in this loop, every time we run a pilot or run an experiment, we want to make sure that we're measuring the results of that and using the evidence to determine what we do next. That's one of the key things here and feeds right into our topic of measuring success. So I'll move on next to that strategy step within the framework. At Agile 42, we use this framework called an Agile strategy map as a way to build an Agile transformation strategy. The strategy map is based on something originally called the Intermediate Objectives Map. William Detmer has written about that. We've modified that structure slightly to bring in some of this empirical approach into it. So I'll describe that a little bit. And again, I just want to give a brief overview of the structure. So the strategy map starts with that green box in the middle. That's the goal. That's where we want to define in a clear and succinct way, why are we going about this Agile transition? What do we hope to accomplish by going through this effort? The next level in the strategy map are the yellow boxes. We call these possible success factors. And we call it possible success factor because when we go through this process, we're making a hypothesis about those factors that will enable us to achieve the goal. Until we've measured the results of those success factors, we don't yet know if they in fact are the key success factors. We'll talk more about that coming up. The next level down is our red boxes. These are called necessary conditions. So each success factor can have one or more necessary conditions. And these are the things that we need in order to achieve or fulfill the corresponding success factor. Again, here there's a link that I've listed here. If you want to dig in more into the strategy map, there's more information there. Let me further illustrate this with a bit of an example. So again, starting with the goal for our Agile transition, we'll have an example of that coming up. We'll want to define our possible success factors. Here's an example of one. We believe that by consolidating all projects in one portfolio, we will be able to make better decisions. That's an example of a possible success factor. So our necessary conditions for that are defining what we need in order to run that pilot or run that experiment, which will allow us to verify or validate that success factor. So here's some examples of those. One might be that we need at least 3 projects per product area to run our experiment around the portfolio. We need to choose projects and define comparable dimensions to compare them with, such as value, strategic alignment, and cost. And then third, we need to define a portfolio funnel, or how our projects work through the funnel to get to the point where we can start executing on them. So those are some examples of what necessary conditions might be. So moving forward, let's suppose we run that pilot, we run that experiment on the portfolio, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we run that experiment, we want to define how will we measure the success and failure of that success factor. So here's the same success factor listed here. We might start by defining in a somewhat subjective manner, what does success look like? In this case, it's that we can compare the value of projects easily using defined KPIs and make consistent business decisions. Failure would look like this, that we still have endless discussions about priority, and it's costly to prepare project info within that portfolio process. So we get a subjective view of what success and failure look like. Now we can further define some more objective measures of success in this particular case. Here are a few examples. That it takes less than a day to prepare the business case for a project, less than 8 hours to select priorities on a quarterly basis, and that we don't have any executive overrides on our portfolio priority decisions, that once we commit to those, we stick to them. So let's suppose now that we go ahead and run this experiment around the portfolio, and it succeeds. It meets our criteria for success. So now what? If that pilot is successful, going back to our transition framework, we now want to go through our loop again and determine how are we going to roll out or institutionalize that change after we've tried it on a smaller scale. Now that we've proven that it is in fact a success factor, we're going to change the name of that item. We're now going to call it a CSF, or critical success factor. And we might change the wording on that. So we know that we need to consolidate our projects into one portfolio now. That might also change our necessary conditions perhaps as well, so we might revisit that. Okay, so let's move now into a more concrete example. So I'll show here a strategy map that's based on our years of experience within Agile 42, working with a number of clients, anything from small organizations to very large global enterprises. And we've seen some commonalities between different strategy maps that these organizations have developed. However, I do want to emphasize that we strongly believe that there is no one blueprint that's going to apply to every organization. So we think it's important that every organization go through this activity of building their own strategy and making sure that that is the best strategy within their own context. Okay, so here's a possible goal that you might state for an Agile strategy: sustainably faster delivery of solutions that delight customers. Let's go through what might be some potential success factors for that goal. So first, faster time to market. We almost always see this or some variation on time to market as one of the success factors. Organizational priorities aligned with customer value is another common one. We need to really be focused on customer value. At the practices level, we know that we need to both grow and sustain Agile practices across a number of teams. In order to do that, we also need alignment and support for our Agile transition across the organization at different levels. I believe it's important that we keep in mind that we are an organization of people, and ultimately we need our people to be engaged and really joyful in the work that they do. If we can take care of that, a lot of other things will take care of themselves. Agile is all about continuous improvement, and as an organization we want to be continuous learning, so that tends to be a strong success factor. Finally, transparency and having an empirical view of the performance of the organization is key, and that's really the focus of today's talk is how do we get that empirical view, how do we make that transparent across the organization. So again, here are 7 common success factors that we see in Agile transitions. Again, these might not be the right 7 for your organization. You should go through this activity and validate or develop what's going to work best in your situation. So those are our first level of success factors. I want to show a few examples of how the necessary conditions for each of these success factors might look. This is a somewhat abbreviated list. I'm not going to take time to explain every single item on here, but I might just point out a few to illustrate by example what this might look like. So if I look at towards the upper right, faster time to market. Some of the conditions that we might identify in order to achieve that could be incremental delivery, which is of course one of the cornerstones of Agile development. Collaborative cross-functional teams, we might identify that as a key enabler of faster time to market. Automated testing and deployment might be really important. And then fourth, we believe that we need to balance workload with capacity, limit work in process in order to get faster time to market. So again, there's a few examples of those necessary conditions. Also want to point out here that as we're really focusing on metrics in this talk, that this activity of defining the necessary conditions will often directly correlate to the individual metrics that we select. And conversely, as we select metrics, those likely will inform our necessary conditions. So I think there's an iterative feedback loop here in developing the strategy between the metrics and these necessary conditions. Okay, so at this point, we have an overall strategy for our Agile transition. Let's move now into how do we define some KPIs, key performance indicators or metrics around the transformation. Let's start with that green box in the middle in our goal. So here I've restated the goal in the green box, sustainably faster delivery of solutions that delight customers. And that goal itself kind of immediately suggests at least three things that we want to measure. The first one in the blue line there is customer satisfaction. And let me point out that for most of the metrics or indicators that I'll talk about through this presentation, we'll be measuring those over time. So we'll be looking at trends. Whatever our starting point is, we want to see the change in time and the trends on these metrics, typically, as opposed to just a single point in time number. So here on this graph, we're looking over a number of months at our customer satisfaction rating. We're looking at the red line in terms of how many of our projects are meeting the timelines that our business requires. That could be perhaps a subjective view, a poll of our business stakeholders or customers to understand their perception of our timeliness. It also could be measured somewhat more objectively in terms of projects meeting expected delivery dates. Finally, we want to measure sustainability, and in this case, the sustainability is indicated as employees telling us that workload is sustainable. Again, that's a subjective measure, but it's measurable through a poll. We could also have some more purely objective measures, such as the number of overtime hours that people are working. So here's some high-level lagging indicators for that highest level goal. Notice that these are lagging indicators and that we can kind of measure after the fact how we're doing, but they don't necessarily tell us along the way if we're heading in the right direction. So those leading indicators is something we'll cover coming up pretty soon. All right, let's move now to the next level down in our strategy, those success factors, whether they're possible success factors or we've already proven them and we're calling them critical success factors now. I hinted earlier that we want to have both leading indicators and lagging indicators for each of these success factors. And again, leading indicators are those metrics that will tell us ahead of time if we're moving in the right direction. The lagging indicators are the ones that will tell us after the fact if we have in fact achieved what we hoped to with that success factor. So both of these types of metrics are valuable for us to define. Not always easy to define great metrics in both categories, but we certainly want to attempt to define good metrics under both. For this slide, I don't want to read through each of the indicators. I'm going to show some visualizations coming up. What I want to point out here is that in developing your strategy and developing the metrics, I just think it's useful to have this sort of basic view as you're discussing with your team and your organization what metrics are important, to make sure that you're considering both leading and lagging indicators for each and every success factor in the strategy. And brainstorming these, you might prioritize them or refine them and narrow them down to a handful that are going to give you the best information. So let's move on to show how we might visualize some of these leading indicators for our first success factor in our strategy. In this example, it's time to market. So on the left side here, we're showing a graph of total number of concurrent projects in the organization. And lean thinking teaches us to limit work in progress, and it's really difficult to shorten your time to market without reducing work in progress, or WIP, as it's always called, often called in lean terms. So this is a good leading indicator for us. If we're reducing the number of concurrent projects or products that we're working on as an organization, we're likely shortening our lead time, our time to market. Similarly, I might want to measure the average number of concurrent projects per person within my development organization. That's another good measure to indicate how quickly we're likely to be getting to market. Got a few lagging indicators on the right side here. And just to define those metrics a little bit, lead time is generally defined as how long it takes between something being requested and the time when we get to that first deployment of actual value to our customers. Cycle time is typically defined as whenever we start development in earnest until we get to that first deployment. So these are very objective lagging indicators of our time to market. Finally, because Agile is an iterative and incremental development method, we might also want to measure how frequently we're able to deploy new capabilities, new features, after the initial delivery of a particular product or project. So we're going to hope in all of these cases that our trend line is moving down, that we're reducing the time it takes us to deliver in all cases. Let me move on now to how we might get to a little more detail at the program level or project level around being able to meet business needs in terms of timelines. This is a burn-up chart. And by the way, version 1 tool will have similar ways of measuring and visualizing this. So this is a conceptual view of how you might do this in any tool. But the idea here is that on the vertical axis, we're measuring the total scope of a particular program or project in story points. If you prefer, you could simply count the number of features that you need to deliver. So that black horizontal line represents our planned scope. The green vertical line represents our deadline or our planned delivery date, and our horizontal axis is measuring time. Whether you want to count that in sprints or weeks, doesn't really matter. The blue line there proceeding up from the lower left, that's measuring the actual number of story points that our team or our combined set of teams has completed up to that point. So we have empirical evidence of what our team is capable of delivering. We can project forward for that, this dotted line, which is our trend line, and we can also use that data to show at our highest velocity and our lowest velocity where we're likely to end up, so we can kind of see best case, worst case scenarios. So this is, again, a leading indicator that's going to tell us empirically if we're on track to meet our program goals or our project goals. All right, let's move on to success factor 2 and show some examples of leading indicators for that one. So success factor 2 is organizational priorities aligned with customer value. Here's some examples of some leading indicators. The top graph here, these are subjective measures that we can make measurable through conducting a poll of a number of folks. The first line, the blue line there, is how effective is our prioritization process? We're really thinking here primarily at the portfolio level. So when we do portfolio level prioritization, how effective do folks think that process is? The red line tells us if we're able to effectively compare and measure the relative value of different projects or products that make up that portfolio. The third one, the green line, is a measure of how well do we do at making those priorities visible across the organization, and how well do we respect those priorities. So what we're trying to do here is counter what often happens, where although we nominally have a set of priorities at the priority level, we have folks who have their pet projects and they somehow work behind the scenes, or they find a backdoor way to get projects accomplished that really are not prioritized within the portfolio. The bottom chart here is measuring our churn in priority. Again, it's a trend over time, and I'll try to define what we mean by churn here. I think of churn as the percent change we have after whatever our commitment point is. So at the portfolio level, if we're prioritizing, for example, on a quarterly basis and we commit to a set of priorities, how often do those portfolio level priorities change? At the team level, we might be looking at each sprint, and how often do our sprint level commitments change after we've made a sprint commitment. I think it's important to point out here that part of agility, a key part of it, is the ability to respond to change. And of course, we're going to expect that there will be change. However, at the team level, at the sprint level, we would expect that a change in priorities after a team has made a sprint commitment should be pretty rare. If we're talking about a 2-week timeline, we should be able to pretty consistently work on those priorities without seeing a lot of change. At the portfolio level, again, if we're doing quarterly, for example, portfolio prioritization, we would expect to see changes on a quarterly basis, but once we get into that quarter, once again, we would expect to see those priorities remain fairly solid. All right, this is another chance for our audience to participate. So we got a second poll question here. Throw that out at this time to the audience. As we think about making the business case at a portfolio level for which projects or products we're going to invest in, we typically have some kind of a business case that includes the expected return on that investment. What's the business value of the project? So we want to ask here, how often does your organization actually follow through and validate that our projects meet the predicted business goals that they were expected to achieve? I'll turn this over to the audience once again, give everybody a few moments to think about that question and respond. Give it just a few more seconds here. Looks like we still have a few results coming in. All right, see how this is looking. So certainly encouraging in this case to see that the majority of folks on the phone here either always or at least sometimes close the feedback loop on the project level and follow through to validate that projects deliver what's expected. We'll see how that plays into our metrics, I think, coming up here in just a moment. But I have seen a number of organizations that put a fair amount of effort into estimating the expected benefits of projects in order to prioritize them, which is, of course, extremely important, but then fail to follow through and validate which projects actually achieve that expected value. So that is something we would like to be able to measure, and I think that also fits in with the success factor of our priorities being aligned with customer value. We want to close that loop and validate that what we deliver is actually delivering the value expected. Now notice that we're talking about value here, and that's not necessarily the same thing as scope, because our scope may change from what we originally planned as we learn about something, but we still want to be able to deliver the value. So some lagging indicators on this success factor. Top one here, the first one, the blue line, is a measure of how much of our team's time is actually spent working on those projects that have been prioritized within our portfolio. And oftentimes we'll be surprised to learn that many of our team members are spending a pretty good chunk of their time working on something else, something that might just be a drive-by or a phone call or a casual email of someone asking, hey, could you do this thing for me? And we might be surprised to learn that folks are spending quite a bit of time doing that. Our green line here is what we just were talking about in the poll. How much value are we delivering versus what we actually predicted when we made that business case up front? The bottom chart here, the actual thing you measure might depend on your organization, what kind of projects or products you're actually developing, but certainly a good lagging indicator of how well we're doing is, are we generating new sales? Are we increasing our number of users? Some measure here that would objectively tell us if we're moving the needle in the right direction around customer engagement, customer sales, number of active users we have on our products. All right. So certainly we want to compare those actuals with the forecast and close the loop. It kind of holds people accountable for making realistic estimates up front around those expected benefits for a particular project or product. Okay, so we've talked now about our first couple of success factors. Let's look briefly here at our next two, success factor 3 and 4, alignment and support across the organization, and grow and sustain Agile practices. So I'm not going to read through the table here, but I'll move forward to some slides that will again show how we can visually measure some of the indicators related to these success factors. Let's look next at our success factor 3, alignment and support for the Agile transition. So in the upper left here, it might be useful to measure what level of consensus do we have among our executive team or our senior leadership team for the strategy that we put together. This likely would be an anonymous poll of that group to make sure that they're actually on board with it. Underneath that, our guiding coalition hours. So every successful Agile transition that I've been a part of had some form of a guiding coalition. You might call that an Agile transition team, Agile champions team. Mike Cohn calls it the enterprise transition team. Whatever you call that, this is the group that are actively involved in guiding the transition, and it might help to understand how many hours are those folks putting into this effort, because we would expect that in order to carry things forward, we're going to need a substantial effort from that group. Alignment is also about people in the trenches, our employees, our teams that are actually delivering. How well are they aligned with the strategy, and do they agree with it? And as we get more and more teams ramped up in Agile development, how many of those people actually prefer the Agile approach over what they were doing in the past? So these are some indicators that will help us know if we're on the right track. Communicating the strategy and celebrating successes is an important part of creating alignment, and the table here in the lower right is an example of how we might at least take a subjective look at how often are we communicating the strategy. Are we making sure we're repeating that message in multiple forums so that everyone's aware of the strategy and they're aware that our senior leadership really means it, that they're committed to it. And what are we doing to celebrate our wins when teams deliver and they have success with their Agile practices? What are we doing to celebrate that and make that celebration visible? All right, let's move on to success factor 4, grow and sustain Agile practices. So some leading indicators that we might have here. Our top chart, we might want to look at how many people across the organization have received training on Agile so that they're empowered and able to take some action on their own. Our green line might measure how many people have been on coached projects, so pilot projects that have had coaching to get those teams up to speed. One other thing that we found very successful in Agile transition is to have an internal coach training program, or if you will, a coach the coach initiative, identifying who are those internal champions or subject matter experts that we're going to be training up to carry our Agile transition forward. So how many people are participating in that program? Now down at the bottom chart here, we've got some lagging indicators. Assuming we have that coach the coach program in place, our blue line shows us how many people have graduated from that program and earned the right to call themselves a coach. We might look at third-party Agile certifications. How many of our folks are achieving those certifications? And the yellow line, COP here, that stands for Community of Practice. Another common success factor in many Agile transitions is forming these communities of practice that empower folks across multiple teams to get together and share what's working and learn from each other. So for example, we may have a community of practice for Scrum Masters, and they're going to hone their craft within that community. We might have a community of practice of developers who hone their technical skills around things like automated unit testing, for example. So we could measure the attendance at those to get an idea of how well folks are aligned and how well we can sustain our practices by attendance at those kinds of communities. All right, so we've got a couple other success factors as part of the original strategy that we showed here. I'm just going to briefly refer to some of these. At this point, we've seen many examples of how we can visualize this. I mentioned earlier that this one's a key one to me, success factor 5 here, that we have engaged and joyful people. And there are studies out there that have empirically shown that engaged employees is highly correlated with better business outcomes, better profit, happier customers, higher revenues. So I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that ultimately if we're going to sustain an Agile transition, we need people to be happy at the work that they're doing. We want them to be engaged and beyond just satisfied. We'd really like them to be joyful in their work. So how can we get some leading indicators around that? Certainly we could poll our employees periodically and understand, do they think things are on the upswing or are things getting worse? As we go through Agile transition, oftentimes roles are shifting and people are unclear what their career path is in the new world of Agile. So having clear career paths defined for all roles can help people feel confident that they have a future within the organization and they can advance their career, even with things changing. Some lagging indicators certainly around employee job satisfaction. A very lagging indicator is your attrition rate. If people are leaving, are they staying? That's a little bit too late to do anything about it then, but it's a good measure of how happy people are. Another one might be how many referrals you get. If your company is hiring and employees are referring their friends and colleagues, that's a good indication that they're happy with the way they see things going if they want to invite their friends to join in. Success factor 6 here, a culture of continuous learning and improvement. I think this is absolutely key. At the heart of every Agile transition is shifting the mindset within the organization to one of continuous improvement and continuous learning. So it's important that we have some measures that will drive behavior and change people's mindset around what that means. Some simple leading indicators: are our teams having retrospectives and how often? Sometimes you'll hear this language in Agile around celebrating failure or fast failure. I like to think more of that as learnings. Are we celebrating our learnings? This empirical approach and the Agile approach is all about running small experiments. Each sprint you can think of as an experiment and how we can get better in a short time period. And when we celebrate our learnings in those experiments, we want to celebrate them. We want to remind people that it is okay to run those experiments. If we don't let people know that that's okay, they'll always be afraid that they're going to fail, and so they'll always take the safe route, and that will really stifle innovation. So we want to know that people feel safe to run those experiments and demonstrate as leaders that we're supporting them in that. You might look at lagging indicators in that case. How many team-initiated process changes are happening? So at the grassroots level, how many process changes are happening there? How many product innovations are coming out of our teams? Finally here, the success ratio of experiments we run, either on our product features or on process changes. An important thing to note here is, as mentioned at the bottom, our asterisk, if you have a very high rate of success in the experiments you're running, to me that indicates that there probably still is some fear of failure, that people are not willing to take any risks, that they're always on the safe side. So again, we want to design safe-to-fail experiments. Going back to our first slide on the enterprise transition framework, we need to design safe-to-fail experiments, but we need to encourage that if we want to enable innovation. All right, let me move on to a different level of metrics now, because certainly an important part of every Agile transformation is how well our individual teams are doing. The teams are where the rubber meets the road and where we actually deliver. So how do we know how well our teams are doing, each of those individual teams? At Agile 42, we have something we call the Agile Practices Roadmap, and I'll briefly describe the structure of it. It's intended to guide teams in how they can adopt Agile practices over time and achieve an increasing level of effectiveness and maturity, if that's maybe the right word to use here. So let me highlight just the structure of this. So across the top here, our practices roadmap is divided into these 4 different categories. We have healthy team practices, product planning, technical practices, and short-term or sprint planning practices. Down the left here we have multiple levels. This page shows the first 2 levels. The next page will show levels 3 and 4. And then each of the cells in our table lists some number of practices under these different categories that might apply at each of these levels of maturity. So I want to caution that this roadmap is not intended to be a one-size-fits-all, although it tends to be a really great starting point for a team to get a good picture for what are all the practices we might want to consider as we grow and mature as a team. It's certainly intended to be customized and tailored by a team so that they can take ownership of it, make sure it makes sense in their context. But if you look at a complete list of all the Agile practices out there, this covers many of them. So again, I won't read every one of them, but if I look over on the right here where my red arrow is, under short-term or sprint planning, at level 2, we want to be doing essentially our sprint basics. Sprint planning, we want to have some contingency plan for maybe a percentage of production work that we might have to do within a sprint that we can't plan for. Daily stand-ups, backlog refinement, sprint review, sprint retrospectives, and the burn down. The check marks and the X's here is something that an individual team can use to track which of these practices have we implemented and which ones do we still need to work on. So I'll move forward now and show what we've included in level 3 and level 4 for the practices across these 4 categories at those different levels. Once again here, I don't want to take the time to read everything that's on here. I'll just point out a few things. As we get to our final level of maturity and effectiveness, level 4, we call that level high performance. Under the technical practices, for example, We will probably at this point be doing some amount of pair programming. We'll be increasing the amount of automated tests that we have. We'll be bringing down technical debt we have in our code. We'll probably be practicing TDD, or test-driven development, and at a higher level, ATDD, or acceptance test-driven development. We should be doing refactoring, and we should have achieved collective ownership over the code or the product at this point. So again, those are just some examples of some of those practices that really get a team to that level of high performance. Let me show a way that you can visualize this a little bit in a more succinct way. So this is a radar chart or a spider chart showing that same practices roadmap for a particular team. And in this radar chart, each of the 4 axes coming out represents one of the 4 dimensions, those team practices, product planning, technical practices, and sprint planning. The numbers here, 0 through 4, represent which level within the roadmap has the team achieved across each of those dimensions. And like previously, our previous metrics, we're measuring over time how a team is progressing. So if you notice on the right side, our legend shows month by month, how is the team advancing through those different levels of practice maturity and hopefully getting better in each of those levels. One thing I want to caution against here, we started off by mentioning that we don't want to overemphasize process compliance in an Agile transition. It's certainly important to look at, but want to make sure that we're not encouraging behavior of teams to just do process for the sake of process. We want these practices to benefit a team. We don't want them to feel like they're under pressure to show that they're adopting certain practices just because someone is watching this metric. Looking a bit more broadly at the team level, using the same 4-level maturity model, we can look at our different teams and understand what level each team has achieved. So in this case, we're not looking at the 4 dimensions, but we're looking at the highest level they've achieved that encompasses all 4 of those dimensions. So once a team has achieved level 3 across all 4 dimensions, we could call them a level 3 team, for example. Once again, we might even look at this over a trend of time. So want to quickly talk now about some bad things that can happen with metrics and how we might guard against that. So one last poll for the audience here. Before we jump into that topic, we'll give everyone a few moments to read the question here. So the question is, how often are metrics chosen based on what's easy to measure rather than what's the right thing to measure? Just take a moment or two to answer that one, and then we'll wrap up the presentation and move into questions. Looks like we still have a few more votes coming in. I'll give it another few seconds, and we'll look at the results. Okay, so may still be a few more results coming in, but want to ask this question because oftentimes we do fall into a trap of measuring what's easy to measure, and that thing we're measuring might be a proxy for what we actually want to measure. Sometimes it's a pretty reasonable proxy, and sometimes it's a pretty poor proxy for what we're actually trying to measure. So the message here is that we want to challenge ourselves to make sure that we're really measuring what does matter, even if it might be harder to measure. So here's some questions we might want to ask, or I recommend you do ask about every metric we're looking at. And first and most importantly, what decisions will be made based on this metric? In the presentation here, we had metrics that were all aligned with our possible success factors in our strategy. So there should be a clear line drawn that each metric will help us make a decision around whether our possible success factor is the right success factor. And once we've proven it is a success factor, is it moving the needle the right direction in our overall goal? So we should be able to make a clear decision based on each metric. If we can't, then we should perhaps think about setting that metric aside if it's really not going to be actionable. Second, as our poll just indicated, we want to ask, is it the right thing to measure, or is this just a proxy that's easier to measure? Very important to think about what might be the unintended consequences of measuring a particular KPI or metric, and asking how could that metric be gamed. If folks feel under pressure to make the metrics look good, what might they do to game that metric? And finally, what can we do to guard against those unintended consequences and gaming of the metrics? One thing that's often useful is the idea of compensating or balancing metrics. So suppose that we want to somehow measure our speed of delivery. And if we really emphasize that measure, what might be the unintended consequences of that? And if we think about the consequences of that, in this case it might be, well, people could make shortcuts in quality in order to make our short-term speed of delivery look faster. So how do we compensate for that unintended consequence or counteract that? And in this example, we could measure both speed and quality. So if we're measuring speed and quality, we can hopefully avoid that unintended consequence of people taking shortcuts on quality in order to make speed look better. I also like to point out the difference between management level metrics and team level metrics. I think a good metaphor for that is a dashboard in your car is for the driver to look at to know the important things that you need to know to drive the car. But when we go to a mechanic and we look under the hood, they're looking at very different kinds of metrics. They're looking at voltages and compression ratios and fuel mixtures and lots of things that to your typical driver simply aren't going to matter or make sense, and they really might confuse the issue. So it's important to separate out which metrics are intended for a team, those under the hood metrics, and which measures are important for managers to be looking at. With that, I'm going to wrap up the presentation portion of this. I'll turn things back over to Aaron so we can get a few questions answered before we wrap up.
All right, Brad, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Lots of good stuff. We have a few minutes to answer questions that have come in. In addition, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A panel on your console right now. While you're doing this, we would like to remind everyone to join us for part 2 of this webinar, which is next Wednesday, June 25th, from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Now on to the questions. You ready, Brad?
Yep, I'm ready.
All right. A good first one is several people wanting to know if you can talk a little bit more about the approach you use for assessing where the organization or department is before starting out on an Agile transformation.
Yeah, good question. That's going to depend on whether is this an organization that is brand new to Agile versus an organization that might have been practicing for some time. So if it's an organization that has teams that have been practicing for some time, we might look at that practices roadmap essentially as a starting point and do an assessment to understand how many of those practices are the teams currently implementing and how well are they implementing them. So that gives us a sense for where the teams are starting out, what level of maturity they're at. Now, if they haven't started, that won't be as useful. So we'll be looking more organizationally at what are the organization's goals. We'll do some interviews and polls of people to understand what are the pain points that you're experiencing today with your product development efforts or your project work, so we can understand what kind of pain points we need to address. And based on that, we'll design the strategy around addressing those pain points. Again, we often see that many of these success factors that I showed today tend to apply, and we tend to see a lot of the same pain points with organizations that are starting out. So that's a fairly brief answer, I realize, but I don't know if I can fully answer that in a limited time we have here, I guess. So hope that's at least a starting point.
Good, yeah. And that practice roadmap that Brad is referring to was slide 27. Remember, links to the recordings and his great slide deck will be made available. Another question here about risk. What are some of the common risks that are involved in Agile transformations in the initial stages, assuming everyone is new to Agile in the organization? And how can you mitigate these risks? I know it's a big question. Maybe you've got a couple answers here.
Sure. Some of the risks that I've seen are whether or not we have a true commitment within the organization and a sense of urgency around making changes. So it's a pretty big endeavor, and I think oftentimes organizations and especially senior managers may not fully understand just how much is involved. Sometimes organizations start out assuming that this is a team level thing. I just need to get teams to start doing practices differently, and that's the extent of the change. So one of the risks I see is in senior managers not understanding that there is more to it than team level changes. And by going through this process of doing an assessment at the organizational level and then getting our senior managers engaged in developing the strategy, that's the first step in helping them see that, there is more to it than just team level practices. There are some really important organizational level things that need to happen. So getting that commitment from senior management up front is important. Another risk that I see is, again, that focusing too much on simply process compliance and really just trying to force teams to adopt a set of practices. I think we need to respect the teams and give them a framework to help improve, give them a sense of empowerment, but not feel like this is just process mandate and that it becomes yet another process mandate coming down from above. We need to get buy-in from folks. So that's going to happen through explaining to them why are we doing this and how can it help you, how can it help us as an organization.
Sure. Balance is on the minds of a lot of people in the audience. Balance between not getting bogged down in the requirements along with the very real need for estimating business value. How do you balance those seemingly competing desires?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. In terms of estimating, that's always a challenge, and I think Agile brings some good practices to the table, things like relative estimating with story points or T-shirt sizes that enables us to have some high-level estimates that can be accurate without being as heavyweight and assuming that we have to be as precise as we may have been in the past. In terms of business value, I think it's important to, again, think about incremental delivery so that we can have a more empirical measure of how much value we actually are delivering. Ultimately, we need to deliver fast and frequently so that we can validate whatever we are delivering is, in fact, meeting our customers' needs. And so we have more decision points where we can determine whether a project is on track to deliver the expected business value with the right, at the expected cost and schedule that we're aiming for. Yeah, I know it's a pretty brief answer, but I know we're kind of short on time.
Yeah, we are, and we're going to have to wrap up. I'll give you one more question here. People had a lot of questions about evaluating and quantifying things.
Mm-hmm.
One person asked specifically, how do you evaluate value delivered? How do you quantify value? Another difficult thing to answer, but maybe you can just touch on it.
Yeah, it is a tough thing, and again, I think the shift that I like to see is from measuring it simply based on did we deliver a plan to scope to did we achieve the right business objectives. So value, I think some examples of how that could be measured might be in terms of did we increase revenue? Did we achieve the cost savings that we expected? Did we attract a certain number of new customers? Did we increase our customer satisfaction level in a customer satisfaction poll? If we move beyond just the narrow view of scope delivery as value, we could still consider at a higher level, did we deliver the capabilities, the higher level capabilities that we intended to deliver? And again, the lower level scope, the individual stories and maybe features that we delivered in order to achieve that higher level business capability may have changed along the way, but as long as we delivered the business capability that was expected, that's another way to some extent measure value as opposed to purely scope. Again, another
Absolutely.
brief answer, but I hope that gives some examples.
That's great. Well, thank you, Brad, for an excellent presentation. Lots of good detail in there. And thank you to everyone for joining today's AgileLIVE event hosted by Version 1. We look forward to seeing you next week for Part 2. Goodbye now.